Let's have a look at the first trend. 2010s was America's decade, according to data. America's share of the world economy, just look at this, increased to 25%. It went up when many people thought that was going to be the end of America. America's share of the world economy went up to 25%. Compare that with Europe. It fell sharply to 15% of the world economy. The whole of Europe, 15% share of the world economy. China surged from around 9% to 16%, almost doubling. Huge surge in China. And India inched up from about 2.7, 2.8 to 3.4. But it inched up. But it was America's decade. Now, moving on, if we look at the impact of this, for example, look at what America's decade meant for returns in financial terms. As a financial superpower, America dominated like never before in the 2010 to 2019. The returns in America, the gains you made on the stock market was 256% in that decade, right, Ruchir?
Yes.
And next, Europe, you're saying 75? That is huge. What a difference.
Exactly. I think that is, for me, is the key distinguishing factor, which is that, as you mentioned, that even China's GDP surged from 9 to 16.
Right.
But what made this truly America's decade is that as a financial superpower, America never sort of dominated this
like
way,
this,
as it has come to be.
This is amazing
And
finding.
as a result, today, the American stock market alone is 56% of
the world stock
market value. So that is a new high for America. So its economy is 25, but its stock market is 56% of the global stock market value.
As you're saying, as you're speaking, China figures you brought up are 72%. That's just less than 1/3 of America. And emerging markets in India, 49%, and India around 46% increase in the whole decade. A huge dominance by America. It's amazing to know. Everybody, okay, America's done well, but this kind of dominance is startling from those data.
Right, and I'll just make one more point here regarding India's data as well. That in dollar terms, as you can see, the returns were just not that impressive this decade. Very different from what happened in the previous decade.
Oh, I see.
And even for the domestic investor, the domestic investor in India doesn't care much about dollar returns. They care much more about how much that they are sort of getting in rupee terms. But a very important point here, and that's why the dollar returns are also so much lower, that in India, inflation was relatively high. So even though it optically appears to us
that
the returns were good, that the Sensex doubled in value in some way over this entire decade, or the Nifty did so well in nominal terms, but if you look at it in real terms, inflation-adjusted terms, the annual returns in the stock market in India were less than 5% a year.
That's it.
That's it. Way lower than what we had in the previous decade. And obviously, as far as America is concerned, because inflation there is so low, the real returns in America were
very close to the
multiple times what you got in India. So that is the big difference in terms of the return profile.
Now, you were mentioning a very interesting finding again, that each decade there's a different kind of a winner, the big winners in each decade. Just have a look at the big winners over the last 50 years. Every decade had a big winner and a different one from one decade to the next. The decade of the 1950s belonged to Europe. The 1960s belonged to United States. The 1970s, basically commodities rule the waves there. 1980s, Japan, can hardly remember that, but my gosh, they did very well. 1990s was back to the USA, that's 4 decades later. And then 2000s, emerging markets. That's because you were handling emerging markets, right? Some coincidence there. 2010, back to USA. So USA's got 3 top spots there. 2010, we just saw was a huge dominance. And now we're going to look ahead based on these. Who's going to dominate the 2020s?
Yeah. And I'll make one point here about this. That what exactly do I mean by this in terms of domination? In all these instances, these markets went up by roughly about 5 to 10 times. In this decade. So a massive amount of gains to be made. And also the fact that by the end of the decade, it got very euphoric. Everyone thought that this trend was going to continue. And then in the subsequent decade, as we will see, that all these trends basically faltered because expectations got too high, complacency built in these countries which were doing so well. Japan, as you mentioned, that it in 1989, at the peak of that bubble, the Japanese stock market was 45% of the world's stock market value.
My God, really?
45%. So this is what happens, that you get bubbles which build up by the end of the decade, often not every time, but you do. And this is what this tells you, that there's one theme which captures the imagination of the world every decade.
And that question mark, if you know who's going to be the next one, you could gain 5 to 10%. So listen
5 to
carefully.
10 times, yeah.
5 to 10 times, sorry, 5 to 10%. That's for every week for him. Okay, now, the interesting point you also make, Ruchir, is that who dominates, the person that dominates one decade, if you just have a look, how they just kind of collapse in the next decade. You were talking about a bubble. So the big winner in one decade becomes a big loser in the next decade. Just have a look at the data that Ruchir has unearthed. The winner decade, there's a 600% return. That's your 5 to 10 times. On average, it's 600.
Yeah.
And the next decade for that winner, what happens? Down 11%. The returns are down 11%. So you lose money compared to gaining 5 to 10 times in the previous decade.
Yeah.
Such a change.
Yeah, and these are in absolute terms, in relative terms, because the other assets do go up. So in relative terms, the performance is even worse.
Minus 11 could be minus 50 or something.
Yeah, in relative terms, because in fact, it's minus 75.
Minus 75?
On average. Wow. That's how sharp the relative performance
others
tends
have gone
to be.
up, so you're saying 11% just on your own, but compared to others, minus 75.
Minus 75.
Wow, what a change. That
on average.
So it's almost like we've never seen anything do the same decade following 2 in a row. So
yeah, dominate the world at least.
Yeah. So what's the first top trend of the 10 top trends of 2020s? Number 1, what is it? America will peak and the rest of the world will rise again. The rest of the world could be, that we are yet to see, could be Europe or could be Asia, emerging markets, but it won't be America. Yeah, and that's a big thing to say because it's 56% of the stock market.
Yeah, because it all feels the best at the peak. When things are going really well. America today, this is the longest economic expansion in America's history, which goes back nearly 200 years in terms of data. The unemployment rate in America today is at a 50-year low. So the whole idea is that this is about as good as it gets as far as America is concerned. And at some point in time, the next year or two, when you have the next recession in America, I think that's when things will change. And the rest of the world will emerge stronger after that. Because so many countries, from Europe to even India and even Japan, they're being forced to clean up the mess of the last decade that has been created here. And once that is done, then those countries will be in a better position to start doing well.
What is so amazing about this kind of analysis is that this is the time when everybody thinks America is doing great, just focus on America, go for it. But you show that at its peak, you should worry.
Yeah, because remember, if we had done this show a decade ago, and that's really what, and we did sort of speak about this, and I wrote about this extensively, at that point in time, the world was crazy after emerging markets. BRICS was supposed to dominate the world.
That's because you were in charge of emerging markets.
So they were supposed to dominate the world.
You misled everybody.
All the projections were in terms of
a linear. You've always been bullish about America in this decade.
Yes, that's right. So that was my basic conclusion when I wrote my first book in Breakout Nations, which is that I was very skeptical of the BRIC domination and thought America, because of its technological prowess, could be the winner of this decade. Of course, I wish I had followed my own advice more, but now here we are.